Section 1. The Shadow of Steel and the Birth of an Idea. The year is 1940. The world holds its breath as a new form of warfare, a terrifying symphony of speed and power, unfolds across the plains of Europe. It is the age of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a doctrine built upon the unassailable might of the armored column. For the infantryman, the soldier on the ground, this is an era of unprecedented vulnerability. He is a figure of flesh and bone standing in the path of a 40-ton steel behemoth, a mechanized predator whose clattering tracks are the harbingers of doom. His traditional tools, the rifle and the machine gun, are little more than noisemakers against the thick, sloped hides of these modern land battleships. The anti-tank rifles of the era, heavy, cumbersome weapons that fire a solid, high-velocity slug, are proving to be tragically inadequate. Their projectiles, born of a 19th-century philosophy of kinetic energy, ricochet harmlessly off the hardened faces of the new generation of tanks, leaving behind nothing but a frustrating spark and a plume of dust. The soldier is left with a profound sense of helplessness, a feeling that the very nature of the battlefield has shifted beneath his feet, leaving him exposed and outmatched. He can dig in, he can hide, but he cannot effectively fight back against the armored spearhead. This imbalance of power is a strategic crisis, a question that echoes through the halls of military planning departments from London to Washington. How can the individual soldier, the cornerstone of any army, reclaim his agency on a battlefield dominated by the machine? How can David be armed to face Goliath? The answer, it was becoming clear, would not be found in a bigger bullet or a more powerful charge of gunpowder. The solution required a paradigm shift, a leap of imagination that would harness a different kind of physics, a more subtle and devastating principle of destruction. The seeds of this revolution lay not in brute force, but in focused energy. For years, a scientific curiosity known as the Monroe effect had been observed by chemists and engineers. Discovered in the late 1880s by Charles Edward Monroe, the principle demonstrated that if an explosive charge was detonated with a hollow cavity or cone shape facing the target, the energy of the blast would not dissipate outwards in all directions. Instead, it would be focused into a narrow, hyper-velocity jet of molten metal and superheated gas. This jet, traveling at speeds of several kilometers per second, could penetrate armor not by punching through it, but by melting and blasting its way through, creating immense pressure and temperature on the other side. It was a key that could unlock the thickest steel door. This concept, later refined and weaponized as the high-explosive anti-tank, or heat warhead, was the theoretical answer to the infantryman's prayer. Yet, theory is one thing. A practical, battlefield-ready weapon is another entirely. The challenge was immense. How to deliver this sophisticated shaped charge to a moving target from a safe distance, using a device that was light enough for a single soldier to carry, and simple enough to be used under the unimaginable stress of combat. The existing delivery systems, like artillery shells, were far too large and required heavy cannons. The problem demanded a fresh perspective, a willingness to think beyond the conventional. The call was answered in the corridors of the United States Army Ordnance Department. It was here that a confluence of brilliant minds and urgent necessity began to coalesce around a radical new concept. The idea was to combine the power of the heat warhead with another burgeoning technology, rocketry. A small, self-propelled rocket could, in theory, deliver the shaped charge with reasonable accuracy and without the punishing recoil of a conventional cannon. This would allow the launcher to be a simple, lightweight tube, little more than a pipe to give the projectile its initial direction. The task of turning this audacious concept into a tangible weapon fell to a team of dedicated engineers and officers, among them a visionary lieutenant named Edward Uhl. Working alongside Colonel Leslie Skinner, Uhl and his team embarked on a journey of rapid innovation. They were not just designing a new weapon, they were inventing an entirely new category of warfare. They experimented with different rocket propellants, fin stabilizations, and electrical ignition systems. The launcher itself was a study in minimalist design. It needed to be sturdy but light, simple to aim, and safe for the operator. Early prototypes were cobbled together from scrap metal, a testament to the urgency of the project. The process was one of trial and error, of late nights spent over drafting tables and long days on the firing range. Each failed test, each sputtering rocket, was a lesson learned, a step closer to the final goal. The team was driven by the knowledge that every day of delay was a day that soldiers on some future battlefield would face the armored tide without a credible defense. They were in a race against time, and the stakes could not be higher. What was emerging from their workshops was something the world had never seen before: a truly man-portable tank killer. It was a simple steel tube, just over 4 feet long, that could be rested on a soldier's shoulder. It was a weapon that drew its power not from the explosive force contained within a brass cartridge, but from the chemical energy of a rocket motor and the focused fury of a shaped charge. It promised to democratize anti-tank warfare, to take the power to defeat a tank from the hands of a specialized artillery crew and place it directly into the hands of the infantrymen. This was more than just a new piece of hardware. It was a symbol of hope, a tangible response to the creeping shadow of mechanized warfare. It was the genesis of a legend, a weapon that would soon earn a curious and enduring nickname, inspired by a popular musician's whimsical gaspipe instrument, the bazooka. Before it could change the course of battles, however, it had to prove itself, moving from the controlled environment of the Aberdeen Proving Ground to the unforgiving crucible of combat. The journey from a brilliant idea to a battle-winning reality was only just beginning, and it would be fraught with challenges, setbacks, and the harsh lessons that only a real war can teach. Section 2. From Blueprint to Battlefield. Forging a Legend. The journey from a promising concept to a mass-produced, field-ready weapon is one of the most challenging aspects of military innovation. A gauntlet of logistical hurdles, engineering compromises, and relentless testing. For the nascent M1 launcher, rocket, anti-tank, 2.36-inch, this journey was undertaken at a breakneck pace, fueled by the escalating demands of a global conflict. By the early summer of 1942, the design had been refined and standardized. The weapon that emerged was a masterpiece of wartime pragmatism. Its official designation was long and technical, but to the soldiers who would soon carry it, its form was refreshingly simple. It was, in essence, a hollow steel tube, approximately 137 centimeters in length, open at both ends. Its weight, a mere 13 pounds, or about 5.9 kilograms without a rocket, was a revolutionary achievement. A soldier could comfortably carry it slung over his shoulder, a feat unimaginable for any other weapon capable of challenging a tank. The design was stripped of all non-essential components. At the front, a simple ring sight for aiming. At the rear, a small shoulder stock and a forward hand grip, often made of wood in the initial models, provided a stable firing platform. The true innovation, however, was the ignition system. Instead of a complex mechanical trigger and firing pin, the bazooka used a simple electrical circuit. 2 standard flashlight batteries were housed in the shoulder stock. When the operator squeezed the trigger, it completed the circuit, sending a current through a wire that ran along the tube to the rear opening. This current would ignite the solid propellant rocket motor of the M6 ammunition, sending the projectile on its way. This electrical system was both a stroke of genius and a potential Achilles heel. It eliminated the heavy, recoil-absorbing mechanisms of a conventional gun, but it also made the weapon dependent on the reliability of simple batteries and wiring, components that could be vulnerable to moisture, cold, and the rough handling of a combat environment. The ammunition itself was just as innovative. The M6 rocket was a small, fin-stabilized projectile tipped with a formidable heat warhead. The shaped charge within its nose was designed to project a focused jet of molten metal, capable of penetrating several tens of millimeters of steel armor, more than enough to defeat the side and rear armor of most tanks on the battlefield at that time. Upon penetration, the effects inside the vehicle would be catastrophic, not from a large explosion, but from the superheated jet of metal and the immense overpressure it created within the confined space. The rocket was loaded into the rear of the tube by a second crew member, who would then connect the rocket's ignition wire to the launcher's contact spring. This two-man operation, a gunner to aim and fire, and a loader to handle the ammunition, became the standard tactical employment for the weapon. The process was simple, but it required communication, trust, and a steady hand under fire. As the design was finalized, the American industrial machine roared to life. In June of 1942, the M1 Bazooka was officially adopted, and production began on a massive scale. Factories that once produced consumer goods were retooled to manufacture these simple yet vital tubes of steel. The demand was insatiable. Tens of thousands of the initial M1 model were produced, followed by hundreds of thousands of its improved successors, the M101 and the M9, throughout the war. This was not the careful, artisanal creation of a specialized sniper rifle. This was the mass production of a tool intended to be ubiquitous, to be in the hands of every infantry company facing the threat of armor. The weapon's informal nickname, bazooka, quickly overshadowed its official nomenclature. The name came from a popular radio comedian of the era, Bob Burns, who played a homemade musical instrument he called a bazooka, a simple trombone-like contraption made from gas pipes. When soldiers saw the new rocket launcher, its simple, pipe-like appearance immediately brought Burns' instrument to mind, and the name stuck. It was a light-hearted, almost whimsical name for such a serious piece of equipment, but it captured the weapon's unpretentious, purely functional essence. It wasn't elegant, but it was made to do a job. Before being shipped overseas in vast numbers, the bazooka needed to be introduced to the troops who would depend on it. Training programs were hastily established. Soldiers who had spent their lives with bolt-action rifles were now handed a futuristic-looking tube that fired a rocket. The training was a crash course in the new realities of anti-tank warfare. They learned about the weapon's strengths, its portability, its lack of recoil, and its powerful warhead. They also learned about its weaknesses. The backblast from the rocket motor was a significant danger, a jet of flame and hot gas that could seriously injure anyone standing behind the launcher. This meant the operator had to ensure his rear was clear before firing, a difficult task in the chaos of a firefight. They learned about the rocket's slow flight speed, which required the gunner to lead a moving target, aiming ahead of it as one would with a shotgun. And they learned about its effective range. While the rocket could travel up to 400 yards, its practical, effective range for hitting a tank-sized target was much, much shorter. Realistically, inside of 150 yards, and ideally, under 100. This was a weapon for close, brutal encounters, an ambush tool that rewarded patience, nerve, and a well-chosen firing position. As the first crates of these new weapons were loaded onto transport ships bound for distant shores, a sense of cautious optimism permeated the Allied command. They now possessed a potential solution to the tank problem. But a weapon's true worth is never measured on the proving ground or in the factory. It is measured in the mud and dust of the battlefield, in the hands of soldiers facing a determined enemy. The bazooka had been born of theory, forged in the fires of industry, and introduced through hurried training. Now, it was time for its trial by fire, a test that would take place on the arid plains and rocky hills of a new and unforgiving theater of war. North Africa. Section 3. Trial by Fire. The North African Crucible. November 1942. The world's attention is fixed on the coast of North Africa, where one of the largest amphibious invasions in history is underway. Operation Torch, the Allied landing in Morocco and Algeria, is a massive gamble, a first, bold step to challenge the Axis powers on a new front. Amidst the thousands of soldiers waiting ashore, amongst the crates of rifles, ammunition, and rations, is a new and largely untested piece of equipment, the M1 Bazooka. This was to be its combat debut, the moment where the theories of the Aberdeen Proving Ground would collide with the brutal realities of war. The battlefields of North Africa were a stark and challenging environment. The wide-open desert terrain often offered little cover, making a close-range ambush, the bazooka's ideal tactical scenario, incredibly difficult. The landscape was a world of harsh sunlight, swirling dust, and extreme temperature swings, conditions that would test the limits of any mechanical device, let alone one with a sensitive electrical ignition system. The initial deployments of the bazooka were fraught with challenges. The most significant issue was a lack of adequate training. Many of the soldiers who were issued the weapon had only received the most rudimentary instruction on its use. They were unfamiliar with its trajectory, the critical importance of leading a moving target, and the precise sequence of loading and firing under pressure. In the chaos of their first encounters with German and Italian armor, this lack of experience proved to be a severe handicap. Reports from the front lines painted a mixed and often frustrating picture. Soldiers would fire at enemy tanks from too great a distance, their rockets falling short or veering off target. In other instances, the weapon would simply fail to fire. The simple flashlight batteries that powered the ignition circuit were susceptible to the cold desert nights and the rough handling of transport, sometimes failing at the critical moment. The early M6 rockets also had their own reliability problems, with a not insignificant number of duds that would simply thud harmlessly against an enemy tank's armor. For the German Panzer crews, the appearance of this new weapon was initially more of a curiosity than a threat. They would see a flash from an infantry position, followed by a slow-moving projectile arcing towards them, often missing by a wide margin. They had no frame of reference for such a weapon. It made no loud report like a cannon, and it was being fired by individual soldiers from the shoulder. But even in these early, fumbling engagements, the psychological impact of the bazooka began to take root. For the first time, German tankers had to contend with the fact that any infantryman, hidden in a ditch or a rocky outcrop, could potentially reach out and touch them with a high explosive charge. It added a new layer of tension to their operations, a new uncertainty. They began to view every fold in the terrain, every cluster of buildings, with a renewed sense of caution. Despite the initial setbacks, there were flashes of the weapon's true potential. In the hands of determined soldiers who managed to master its quirks, the bazooka proved that it could work. There were scattered accounts of successful engagements, of armored cars disabled, and light tanks knocked out of action. One of the most famous early successes occurred during the fighting in Tunisia. A small American unit found itself facing an assault by several German tanks. One soldier, armed with a bazooka, held his ground, waiting patiently as a Panzer approached. He allowed the tank to close to a dangerously short distance before firing. The rocket struck the tank's thinner side armor, and the machine, which had been advancing with impunity just moments before, shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from the point of impact. This single act, witnessed by his fellow soldiers, was a powerful demonstration. It was proof that the weapon, when used correctly, could indeed stop a tank. It was a vital morale booster, a story that spread through the ranks, countering the frustrations of the early misfires and misses. The experience in North Africa was a harsh but invaluable learning experience for the U.S. Army. The feedback from the field was analyzed with urgency. The reports of misfires led directly to improvements in the weapon's design. The unreliable battery ignition system was a primary target for redesign. The problems with the rocket motors led to improved quality control and more stable propellants. Perhaps most importantly, the Army recognized the critical need for comprehensive training. The bazooka was not a simple point-and-shoot weapon. It was a system that required skill, practice, and a deep understanding of its capabilities and limitations. New training manuals were written, incorporating the hard-won lessons from Tunisia. Training programs were intensified, using realistic scenarios and live-fire exercises to build soldiers' confidence and proficiency. Soldiers were taught to work seamlessly in two-man teams, to select their firing positions carefully, to aim for the most vulnerable parts of a tank: the rear, the sides, the tracks, and the suspension. They learned the art of the ambush, the importance of patience, and the cold courage required to let a multi-ton steel monster get terrifyingly close before pulling the trigger. The North African campaign, therefore, served as the bazooka's crucible. It was burned by its initial failures, but was not consumed. Instead, it was refined and hardened by the experience. The weapon that would be carried onto the beaches of Sicily and into the hedgerows of Normandy would be a more reliable and effective version of the one that first saw action in Operation Torch. And the soldiers who carried it would be better prepared, more knowledgeable, and more confident in its power. The initial trial by fire had been a difficult one, but it had laid the groundwork for the bazooka to become one of the most iconic and influential infantry weapons of the entire conflict, forever changing the relationship between the soldier on foot and the tank that dominated the modern battlefield. Section 4. The Learning Curve and the Forging of a Doctrine. The lessons learned in the dusty, sun-baked battlefields of North Africa were not just battlefield anecdotes. They were critical data points in a rapidly evolving technological and tactical equation. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department, far from being discouraged by the bazooka's inconsistent debut, treated the feedback from the front lines as an urgent and invaluable diagnostic report. The weapon system had shown a glimmer of revolutionary potential, but it was clear that both the hardware and the human software, the training and doctrine, required significant upgrades. The process of improvement began almost immediately, marking a crucial phase in the weapon's development: the learning curve. The most pressing issue was the M1's temperamental electrical ignition system. The reliance on standard D-cell batteries, while innovative in concept, proved to be a significant liability in the field. The batteries were vulnerable to temperature extremes, losing their charge in the cold and degrading in the heat. Their contact points could corrode in humid environments, and the simple wiring could be easily damaged by the rough and tumble of combat. A dead battery at the moment a tank was bearing down on your position was a catastrophic failure. In response, engineers went back to the drawing board. The result of their efforts was the M101 model, which entered production in mid-1943. This new version addressed the ignition problem head-on. It replaced the problematic battery system with a more robust and self-contained magneto-electric generator. The trigger was no longer a simple electrical switch, but a mechanical handle that, when squeezed, would generate its own electrical pulse to fire the rocket. This eliminated the need for batteries entirely, making the weapon far more reliable across a range of environmental conditions. Other ergonomic and practical improvements were also incorporated. The simple and somewhat fragile wooden furniture of the M1 was replaced with more durable materials. The often criticized front sight was improved for better accuracy, and the rear blast deflector was made more effective. The M1A1 was not a radical redesign, but a thoughtful evolution, a direct response to the expressed needs of the soldier in the field. Concurrently, the ammunition was also undergoing a critical evolution. The early M6 rockets had suffered from inconsistent motor burn and a number of duds. The improved M6A1 and subsequent variants featured more reliable propellants that gave the rocket a more stable and predictable flight path. The electrical contacts on the rocket itself were made more robust to ensure a positive connection with the launcher's firing mechanism. These seemingly small engineering changes had a profound impact on the weapon's overall effectiveness and the confidence that soldiers had in it. However, improving the technology was only half the battle. The Army recognized that the most advanced weapon is useless without a well-trained operator. The experiences in North Africa had demonstrated that the bazooka was not an intuitive weapon to use effectively. A comprehensive training doctrine was developed and disseminated throughout the force. This new doctrine was built around the core concept of the two-man hunter-killer team. The gunner and the loader were trained to operate as a single, cohesive unit. The loader was responsible for carrying the ammunition, inspecting each rocket before loading, arming it, and giving the gunner the all-clear. The gunner's focus was on target identification, range estimation, and applying the correct lead to a moving target. They drilled these procedures relentlessly until the act of loading, aiming, and firing became second nature, a fluid sequence of motions that could be performed under immense pressure. The training emphasized the psychological aspects of anti-tank combat. Soldiers were taught to overcome their natural instinct to fire at a tank from a safe distance. Instructors hammered home the point that the bazooka was a close-range weapon. The highest probability of a successful hit was inside 100 yards, and the ideal range was often as close as 30 to 50 yards. This required a special kind of courage, the discipline to remain concealed and motionless as a target grew larger and larger in the sights, its engine noise a deafening roar. Trainees learned the anatomy of their armored adversaries. They studied silhouettes of German and Italian tanks, learning to identify their most vulnerable locations. They were taught that a frontal shot against the thick, sloped glacis plate of a medium or heavy tank was a low percentage gamble. Instead, they were instructed to maneuver for a flank or rear shot, aiming for the thinner side armor, the engine compartment at the back, or the vulnerable suspension and tracks. A mobility kill, by shattering a track or damaging a drive sprocket, could be just as effective as a catastrophic penetration, leaving the tank stranded and vulnerable to other weapons. This new, holistic approach, combining improved hardware with sophisticated doctrine and intensive training, transformed the bazooka from a problematic novelty into a truly formidable infantry weapon. By the time Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, they were armed not just with the improved M1 Bazooka, but with a new confidence in its capabilities. The soldiers had spent countless hours on the training range, firing at moving targets, practicing their teamwork, and memorizing the weak points of their enemies. They understood the weapon's limitations, but also had a newfound faith in its strengths. The learning curve had been steep and paid for with the frustrating experiences of the early days in North Africa. But the lessons had been learned well. The bazooka was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a fully integrated system of technology and human skill, ready to be deployed on a massive scale. The next chapter of its story would unfold in the mountains and villages of Italy, and, eventually, in the decisive battles for Western Europe, where the David and Goliath encounters it enabled would become the stuff of legend. Section 5. The David and Goliath. Mythos, Sicily, and the Italian Campaign. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943, codenamed Operation Husky, represented a new phase of the war and a new proving ground for the now matured bazooka weapon system. The soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army, wading ashore onto the island's southern coast, carried with them the improved M1 launchers and a level of training and confidence that had been absent in North Africa. The terrain of Sicily, with its rugged mountains, narrow, winding roads, and stone-walled villages, was far better suited to the bazooka's strengths than the open deserts had been. It was a landscape made for ambushes, a place where a small, determined team could conceal itself and wait for an armored column to enter a pre-selected kill zone. It was here, in the close quarters fighting for the island, that the legend of the bazooka truly began to be forged. The German and Italian defenders of Sicily were equipped with a formidable array of armored vehicles, including the tough and reliable Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks. More alarmingly for the Allies, Sicily also marked one of the first significant appearances on the Western Front of Germany's newest and most powerful heavy tank, the Tiger I. This 40-ton behemoth, with its incredibly thick frontal armor and a devastating 88mm main gun, was a terrifying sight. It seemed impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons, capable of destroying Allied tanks from ranges where they could not hope to reply in kind. For an infantryman armed with what was essentially a 2.36-inch rocket, the prospect of facing a Tiger was daunting, to say the least. And yet, it was in Sicily that one of the most remarkable and improbable success stories in the bazooka's history was recorded. During the fierce fighting around the city of Gela, a German counterattack led by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division threw its considerable weight against the American beachhead. The attack included several of the new Tiger tanks. According to battlefield reports, a U.S. infantry team, faced with one of these advancing monsters, managed to achieve the near impossible. Using the terrain to their advantage, they maneuvered to a position where they could get a shot at the Tiger's side. The gunner, demonstrating immense courage and a surgeon's precision, did not aim for the thick main armor. Instead, he aimed for one of the tank's most well-known but minuscule weak points, the driver's vision slit. The small M6A1 rocket, fired from a relatively close range, struck its target with phenomenal accuracy. The focus jet of the heat warhead penetrated the vision block, and while it may not have destroyed the tank outright, the effect inside the crew compartment was enough to disable the vehicle and force its crew to abandon it. This event, while exceptionally rare and requiring a perfect combination of skill, luck, and opportunity, sent a powerful message. It demonstrated that even the most formidable beast on the battlefield was not invincible. It proved that a well-aimed shot, delivered to the right spot, could neutralize a threat that seemed insurmountable. The psychological impact of this success was immense, far outweighing its immediate tactical significance. It was a story of David felling Goliath, a narrative that gave the common soldier a profound sense of empowerment. It affirmed that with courage and know-how, he could stand his ground against the very symbols of the enemy's mechanized might. As the Italian campaign progressed, moving from the rugged terrain of Sicily to the mainland, the bazooka's value was proven time and time again. The fighting in Italy was a brutal, grinding affair, characterized by battles for heavily defended mountain passes and fortified towns. In this environment, the bazooka's versatility became one of its greatest assets. It was used not only in its primary anti-tank role, but also as a powerful infantry support weapon. A single heat rocket could be devastatingly effective against machine gun nests housed in stone farmhouses, enemy observation posts, and small, reinforced bunkers. It gave infantry squads their own portable artillery, a tool for blasting open enemy strongpoints that would otherwise have to be taken by costly frontal assault. The bazooka teams became the can openers for their platoons. The tactics for employing the weapon continued to be refined. Soldiers learned that firing in volleys, having 2 or 3 bazooka teams fire at a single tank simultaneously from different angles, greatly increased the chances of a kill and overwhelmed the tank's crew. They became adept at shoot-and-scoot tactics, firing a single rocket from a concealed position and then immediately relocating before the tank's machine guns or main cannon could retaliate. The cat-and-mouse game between the bazooka team and the enemy tank became a defining feature of the infantry fighting in Italy. The tank crews, in turn, developed a deep and healthy respect for the weapon. They learned to advance cautiously, scanning the windows of buildings and the edges of olive groves for the telltale sign of a simple steel tube. They began to rely more heavily on their own infantry support to screen their flanks and clear out potential ambush positions. The very presence of bazooka teams on the battlefield forced a change in German armored tactics, making them more cautious and less willing to operate without infantry protection. This, in itself, was a strategic victory. The bazooka was not a miracle weapon. It did not destroy a 40-ton tank with every shot. Its success against heavy armor remained a low-probability event that depended heavily on favorable circumstances. But its impact was undeniable. It had transformed the infantryman from a potential victim of the tank into a credible threat. The mythos that grew around it in the hills of Sicily and the mountains of Italy was built on a foundation of real-world success, a testament to the courage of the soldiers who wielded it and the revolutionary power of an idea born from a simple steel tube. Section 6. The Weapon's Psychological Dominion. Fear in a Tube. The impact of a weapon system is never measured solely by its technical specifications or the number of targets it neutralizes. A truly transformative weapon also wages a war on the mind, altering the perceptions, fears, and confidence of both the soldier who wields it and the enemy who faces it. For the American bazooka, this psychological dimension was one of its most profound contributions to the Allied war effort. It fundamentally reshaped the mental landscape of the infantry battlefield, instilling a newfound sense of agency in one and a pervasive, gnawing anxiety in the other. For the Allied infantrymen prior to 1942, the psychological dominance of the tank was absolute. The sound of approaching armor, a low, guttural rumble that grew into a deafening crescendo of squealing treads and roaring engines, was a sound of impending doom. It triggered a primal feeling of helplessness. The soldier in his foxhole was a stationary, fragile being of flesh, while the tank was a mobile fortress of steel, immune to his standard weapons and capable of obliterating his position with casual, impersonal ease. This psychological imbalance was a potent weapon in the German arsenal, often causing units to break and retreat before the tanks even opened fire. The arrival of the bazooka in significant numbers began to subtly, but irrevocably, change this dynamic. The weapon itself, light enough to be carried by one man, felt personal and accessible. It was not a distant, crew-served artillery piece. It was a tool that belonged to the infantry squad. This ownership fostered a new mentality. The infantryman was no longer merely a defender waiting to be overrun. He was now a hunter, capable of actively seeking out and challenging the very monster he had once feared. The simple act of issuing a bazooka to a squad gave its members a tangible and powerful symbol of resistance. It was a psychological shield as much as a physical weapon. The training, which emphasized exploiting the tank's weaknesses, further demystified the armored behemoth. The tank was no longer an invulnerable god of the battlefield. It was a machine with blind spots, with vulnerable flanks, with a soft underbelly. This knowledge was empowering. It replaced passive fear with an active, calculating mindset. The soldier learned to see the terrain not as a place to hide, but as a chessboard for a deadly game of ambush. A ditch was no longer just cover. It was a potential firing position. A ruined building was not just a pile of rubble. It was a sniper's nest for a rocket. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. It gave the infantry a fighting chance, and the belief in that chance was often enough to steady nerves and stiffen resolve in the face of an armored assault. For the German Panzer crews, the psychological effect of the bazooka was the mirror opposite. It introduced an insidious and unpredictable threat into their world. A tanker's greatest advantage had always been his armor, the protective shell that allowed him to dominate the battlefield with a sense of security. The bazooka, and the heat principle it embodied, threatened to render that armor irrelevant. The danger was no longer confined to the front, where enemy tanks and anti-tank guns could be seen and engaged. The danger was now everywhere. It could come from any direction, at any time, from a single soldier who was impossible to spot until the moment he fired. This new 360-degree threat created a constant, low-level stress that wore down even the most veteran crews. Every window in a village street, every thicket of woods, every fold in the ground could now hide a man with a weapon capable of disabling their vehicle. This invisible threat forced them to change their behavior. They had to button up, closing their hatches and relying on their limited periscopes, which drastically reduced their situational awareness and made them more vulnerable to other threats. The days of the lone, marauding tank, confidently plunging deep into enemy lines, were numbered. The bazooka tethered the tank to its own infantry support. Panzer crews became increasingly reluctant to advance without friendly Panzer grenadiers to screen their flanks, to sweep buildings, and to flush out the bazooka teams that might be lying in wait. This tactical shift had significant operational consequences. It slowed the pace of German armored advances and made them more methodical and predictable. The Blitzkrieg's emphasis on rapid, independent armored thrusts was blunted by the need to protect against this ubiquitous infantry threat. The psychological effect was amplified by the nature of a heat warhead penetration. Unlike a solid kinetic shell that might simply punch a neat hole, the jet of molten metal and superheated gas created by a bazooka's warhead had a terrifying reputation. The stories and rumors that spread through the German armored corps, even if exaggerated, painted a grim picture of the aftermath of a successful hit. This fear of the unknown, of a silent, flash-fire weapon, added to the psychological burden. The Americans capitalized on this, sometimes using the bazooka as a tool of deception. A single bazooka team, by firing and repositioning, could simulate a much larger anti-tank defense, pinning down an enemy armored unit for a critical period. The mere possibility of a bazooka being present was often enough to make an enemy commander hesitate, to choose a more cautious and time-consuming course of action. This psychological dominion was a force multiplier. A single, inexpensive weapon in the hands of two determined soldiers could influence the behavior of a multi-million-dollar tank and its highly trained crew. It leveled the playing field in a way that few weapons in history ever have. It did not make the infantrymen superior to the tank, but it established a new, more balanced relationship based on mutual respect and fear. The bazooka gave the foot soldier his courage back, and in doing so, it took a small but significant piece of the tanker's confidence away. In the brutal calculus of war, this mental shift was as important as any physical damage the weapon could inflict. Section 7. The sincerest form of flattery, Panzerschreck and the German response. In the world of military technology, there is no greater validation of a new concept than when your adversary not only recognizes its effectiveness, but actively seeks to copy and improve upon it. For the American bazooka, this ultimate compliment came from the highly skilled and innovative engineers of the German war machine. The German army's encounter with the bazooka in North Africa, and later in Sicily and on the Eastern Front, where they captured examples from Soviet forces who had received them via Lend-Lease, set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the creation of one of the war's most formidable infantry anti-tank weapons, the Panzerschreck, more famously known as the Panzerschreck. Initially, German intelligence was puzzled by the new American weapon. Captured examples were rushed back to Germany for intense study at military research facilities. German engineers, who were themselves world leaders in rocketry and shaped charge technology, were impressed by the elegant simplicity and battlefield pragmatism of the American design. They recognized immediately that the bazooka represented a solution to the very problem their own infantry was facing against the ever-increasing numbers of Allied tanks, particularly the Soviet T-34. They saw the genius in combining a recoilless rocket delivery system with a heat warhead in a man-portable package. However, in their typical fashion, the German engineers were not content to simply create a direct copy. Their analysis identified what they perceived as the bazooka's primary limitation: its relatively small, 2.36-inch, 60mm caliber warhead. While effective against the side and rear armor of many tanks, it often lacked the raw power to reliably defeat the thick frontal armor of the newer, heavier Allied tanks that were beginning to appear. Their decision was to take the core concept of the bazooka and upscale it significantly. The result was the Panzerschreck 54, which was introduced in 1943. The most striking difference was the caliber. The German weapon fired a massive 88mm rocket, a caliber chosen for its already proven effectiveness in their famous anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns. This much larger warhead contained a significantly more powerful shaped charge, giving it the ability to penetrate well over 100 millimeters of armor, enough to threaten any Allied tank on the battlefield, even from the front. This increase in power came at a cost. The Panzerschreck, which translates to tank terror or tank fright, was larger, heavier, and more cumbersome than its American counterpart. Its 88mm rocket also produced a much more violent backblast, a massive plume of smoke and flame that could betray the firer's position and was extremely dangerous to anyone standing behind it. Early models of the Panzerschreck also lacked any sort of shield to protect the operator from the hot, burning propellant that would often spray back from the rocket motor as it ignited and traveled down the tube. This led to its rather grim nickname among German troops, the Affenrohr, or stovepipe. Soldiers were issued with protective ponchos and gas masks, with the filters removed to protect their faces and bodies from the rocket's efflux. This was a crude but necessary measure until a blast shield was incorporated into later models, a feature directly inspired by a captured American bazooka that had a small, simple shield. The development of the Panzerschreck was a clear and unambiguous acknowledgement of the bazooka's revolutionary impact. The German military, which had prided itself on its technological superiority in armored warfare, was now effectively admitting that the Americans had created a game-changing weapon and that they needed a direct equivalent. This was not a case of parallel development. It was a direct reaction, a case of reverse engineering and enhancement driven by battlefield necessity. The rivalry between the two weapons played out on the battlefields of Normandy, the Ardennes, and Germany itself. Allied soldiers now faced an enemy armed with a weapon that was, in many respects, more powerful than their own. The deep, whooshing sound of a Panzerschreck firing became a dreaded noise for Allied tankers. The psychological effect the bazooka had on German crews was now turned back on the Allies. Sherman tank crews, already wary of German 88mm cannons, now had to contend with the fact that a single German infantryman, hiding in a bocage hedgerow or a ruined building, could knock them out with a single shot from his stovepipe. This technological arms race spurred further development on the Allied side. While the 2.36-inch bazooka remained the standard for the remainder of the war in Europe, its limitations against the heaviest German armor, like the Tiger II, were becoming apparent. This led to the development of a more powerful 3.5-inch caliber bazooka, the M1 Super Bazooka, although it would not be ready for service until after the war, making its famous debut in the Korean conflict. The story of the Panzerschreck is therefore inextricably linked to the story of the bazooka. It stands as a testament to the fact that the simple, lightweight tube developed by Edward Uhl and his team was not just a successful piece of equipment, but a groundbreaking tactical concept. The Germans did not copy the bazooka because it was a perfect weapon. It had its flaws, but because the idea behind it was undeniably brilliant. They recognized that the era of man-portable, rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons had arrived, and they were forced to follow the path the Americans had blazed. The sincerest form of flattery, in this case, came in the form of a larger, heavier, and more powerful imitation, a tank terror, born from a weapon that had first taught the world's armored forces a new kind of fear. Section 8. The Bocage and Beyond. The Bazooka in its element. June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy marked the beginning of the end of the war in Europe, but it also plunged the soldiers of the line into one of the most difficult and unforgiving combat environments imaginable: the Bocage country of Normandy. This ancient landscape was a patchwork of small fields and pastures, separated by dense earthen embankments, or hedgerows, that were centuries old and overgrown with thick, tangled vegetation. These hedgerows, often taller than a man and strong enough to stop a tank, transformed the countryside into a confusing, claustrophobic labyrinth. For armored vehicles, the bocage was a nightmare, confining them to narrow, sunken lanes, where their mobility and fields of fire were severely restricted. For the infantry, it was a landscape of perpetual ambush. And for the American bazooka, it was the perfect hunting ground, the environment where it could finally be employed to its maximum, devastating effect. In the close quarters, almost subterranean warfare of the hedgerows, the bazooka's primary limitations, its relatively short range and the slow flight time of its rocket, became far less significant. Engagements were often measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. A German tank, grinding its way slowly down a narrow lane, was a perfect target for a bazooka team concealed in a gap in the hedgerow or waiting around the next blind corner. The two-man hunter-killer teams, now highly trained and experienced, became the masters of this lethal environment. They would allow the lead elements of a German armored column to pass their position, then emerge to fire a rocket into the thin rear or side armor of a Panzer or a Sturmgeschütz assault gun. The resulting disabled vehicle would block the narrow lane, creating a traffic jam and trapping the other vehicles in the column, making them easy targets for other bazooka teams, anti-tank guns, or fighter bombers. This tactic, repeated over and over again in the brutal fighting for Normandy, exacted a heavy toll on German armored formations and was a crucial factor in the slow, grinding Allied advance. The psychological impact on German tank crews, already strained by the constant threat of Allied air power, was immense. To them, every hedgerow was a potential firing point, every shadow a hiding place for an infantryman with a rocket launcher. The bocage became a place of profound dread. Beyond its primary role as a tank killer, the bazooka's versatility shone in the Normandy campaign. The same German machine gun teams that used the thick hedgerows for cover found themselves vulnerable to the weapon. A well-placed bazooka rocket fired into an earthen embankment could neutralize a fortified machine gun nest without exposing the attacking infantry to direct fire. It was used to breach the thick stone walls of French farmhouses and to knock out enemy positions in church steeples. It became the squad's multi-purpose tool for demolition and direct fire support, a pocket artillery piece that could solve a wide variety of tactical problems. The sheer number of bazookas available to the American forces was also a critical factor. By mid-1944, the weapon was a standard issue item, found in every rifle company. This ubiquity meant that no matter where a German tank appeared, there was a high probability that it would be met with bazooka fire. It was a democratic distribution of anti-tank capability that the German army, with its more specialized and less numerous Panzerschrecks, could not match. This saturation of the battlefield with anti-tank rocketry fundamentally changed the tactical calculus for German commanders. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, the nature of the battlefield changed again, shifting to more open terrain and rapid, mobile warfare. Yet, the bazooka remained a vital component of the infantry's arsenal. During the desperate German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, bazooka teams played a heroic role in the defense of key road junctions and towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith. In the cold, snowy forests, small units of American infantry, sometimes cut off and surrounded, used their bazookas to hold off repeated attacks by elite German Panzer divisions. They stalked the massive King Tiger tanks, waiting for an opportunity for a flank shot at the vulnerable tracks or engine deck. While a single 2.36-inch rocket was unlikely to knock out such a heavily armored beast with a single shot, a determined team could harass it, track it, and potentially disable it, buying precious time for heavier anti-tank assets to be brought to bear. The stories from the Battle of the Bulge are filled with accounts of individual heroism, of soldiers standing their ground against overwhelming armored superiority with nothing but a simple tube on their shoulder. They fought in frozen foxholes and from the shattered windows of Belgian houses, their defiance a testament to the confidence the weapon had instilled in them. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes and into the heart of Germany itself, the bazooka was a constant companion to the American GI. It was present in every major battle, a reliable and effective tool that had proven its worth time and again. It had evolved from an unreliable novelty in North Africa into a mature, respected, and feared weapon system. The journey had been a long one, but by 1945, there was no doubt about the bazooka's place in the pantheon of great wartime innovations. It had not won the war on its own, but it had empowered the soldier who did, giving him the means to fight back against the armored fist of the enemy, no matter the terrain or the odds. Section 9. The Numbers Game. Production, Logistics, and the Arsenal of Democracy. The story of any successful piece of military hardware is a tale of two parts. The first is the drama of its design and its performance in the heat of battle. The second, often overlooked but equally crucial, is the story of its production and logistics. The immense industrial and organizational effort required to manufacture it in vast quantities and deliver it to the front lines where it is needed. For the bazooka, this second story is a powerful illustration of the concept of the arsenal of democracy, the unparalleled industrial might of the United States that became a cornerstone of the Allied victory. The bazooka was, by design, a weapon suited for mass production. Unlike a complex artillery piece or a tank engine, which required specialized tooling and highly skilled labor, the bazooka's basic components were relatively simple. The launcher was primarily a steel tube, and its other parts, such as the sights, grips, and firing mechanism, could be manufactured quickly and inexpensively by a wide range of factories. This was a deliberate choice by its designers, who understood that in a total war, the best weapon is not necessarily the most powerful or sophisticated, but the one that can be produced in sufficient numbers to make a difference. Following its official adoption in mid-1942, the American industrial base geared up to produce the M1 and its successors on a truly staggering scale. General Electric was one of the primary contractors for the launcher itself, while other companies, many of which had been producing civilian goods just months earlier, were brought into the supply chain to manufacture components. The real challenge, however, lay in producing the ammunition. Each bazooka in the field required a steady stream of M6 rockets, and these were more complex to manufacture than the launcher. They contained a rocket motor with a solid propellant, a sensitive fuse, and the carefully engineered shaped charge warhead. Millions upon millions of these rockets were needed, not just for combat use, but for the intensive training programs that were now standard for all infantrymen. The numbers are a testament to the scale of the effort. Over the course of the war, approximately 476,000 launchers of all models, M1, M1A1, and the later M9, were produced. The number of rockets manufactured was even more astronomical, reaching well over 13 million units. This flood of production meant that the bazooka could be issued liberally throughout the armed forces. It was not a rare or specialized weapon reserved for elite units. It became a standard part of the equipment for every U.S. Army and Marine Corps infantry squad. This saturation was a key element of its success. An enemy tank might be able to avoid a dedicated anti-tank gun emplacement, but it could never be sure that the next infantry squad it encountered wouldn't have 2 or 3 bazookas waiting for it. The cost-effectiveness of the bazooka was another of its defining features. A single M1 launcher cost approximately $19 to produce in 1943. A single round of ammunition cost a few dollars more. When compared to the cost of a single M4 Sherman tank, which ran into the tens of thousands of dollars, the economic calculus was overwhelmingly in the bazooka's favor. For the price of one medium tank, the Army could equip hundreds of infantry teams with the means to potentially defeat one. This made the bazooka one of the most cost-effective anti-tank solutions of the entire war. It was an asymmetric weapon, not just in terms of tactics, but in terms of economics. The logistical effort required to support this massive deployment was immense. The launchers and their delicate ammunition had to be carefully packed, shipped across thousands of miles of ocean through hostile waters, and then distributed through a complex network of supply depots to the units on the front line. An infantry company in the fields of France needed a constant resupply of rockets, and the Ordnance Corps worked tirelessly to ensure that this supply chain was never broken. This relentless flow of material was something the German war economy, strained by years of fighting and constant Allied bombing, could not hope to match. While their Panzerschreck was a more powerful weapon on a one-to-one basis, it was never produced in the same vast quantities as the bazooka, nor was its ammunition as readily available. German documents from the late war period often mention shortages of Panzerschreck rockets, forcing their soldiers to conserve their fire. The American GI, by contrast, was generally well supplied, able to expend rockets in training and in combat with less concern for their scarcity. The numbers game was not just about weapons. It was about instilling confidence. An American soldier knew that if his bazooka was damaged, another could be easily requisitioned. He knew that his platoon supply sergeant would almost always have more rockets available. This logistical security allowed him to be more aggressive in his use of the weapon, to take chances he might not have taken if the equipment were rare and precious. The story of the bazooka's production is therefore central to understanding its overall impact. It was a triumph of American pragmatism, a weapon designed not for perfection, but for good enough performance combined with unprecedented availability. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The individual courage of the soldier who aimed the weapon was matched by the collective industrial might of the nation that built it, creating a combination that proved to be decisive on battlefields across the globe. Section 10. The Echo of the Tube, Legacy, and the Modern Battlefield. The end of the Second World War in 1945 did not mark the end of the bazooka's story, but rather the beginning of its enduring legacy. The simple steel tube that had been rushed into service as a desperate measure against the Blitzkrieg had fundamentally and permanently altered the nature of infantry warfare. It had introduced a new principle to the battlefield, that a single soldier, with a shoulder-fired weapon, could possess the power to defeat a main battle tank. This concept, so radical in 1942, would become a fundamental tenet of military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The immediate post-war period saw the bazooka's direct evolution. The lessons learned in the final year of the war, particularly the difficulty the 2.36-inch rocket had against the heaviest German armor, had already spurred the development of a more powerful successor. This was the M20 Super Bazooka, which featured a larger 3.5-inch caliber, a more potent rocket, and an improved design that could be broken down into two pieces for easier carrying. While it arrived too late for the Second World War, the M20 would prove its worth dramatically in the next major conflict, the Korean War. In the opening stages of the Korean conflict in 1950, American and South Korean forces, equipped primarily with the older 2.36-inch bazookas, found themselves once again outmatched by a wave of enemy armor. This time, the Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tank. The older rockets were largely ineffective against the T-34's well-sloped frontal armor. The desperate situation was only reversed with the emergency airlift of the new M20 Super Bazookas to the front lines. The larger, more powerful shaped charge of the Super Bazooka could reliably defeat the T-34, and its arrival helped to stabilize the front and turn the tide of the initial invasion. The bazooka's influence, however, extended far beyond its direct descendants. The core concept it had pioneered, a man-portable, recoilless, rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon, became a blueprint for military designers all over the world. The Soviet Union, which had received bazookas through Lend-Lease and had also studied captured German Panzerschrecks, developed its own highly successful series of shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, most famously the RPG family of rocket-propelled grenades. The RPG, particularly the iconic RPG-7, would become as ubiquitous on the battlefields of the Cold War and subsequent conflicts as the bazooka had been in its time. The lineage continued to evolve. The desire for a lighter, disposable, and even more user-friendly weapon led to the development of the M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, during the Vietnam War. The Law was a single-shot, disposable fiberglass tube that came preloaded with its rocket. It was a direct conceptual descendant of the bazooka, stripped down to its absolute essence, a simple, point-and-shoot tank killer that could be issued to every single soldier. In the later decades of the 20th century, the principle was refined further with the advent of guided missile technology. Weapons, like the American Dragon and Javelin, and the European Milan, took the bazooka's concept and added a crucial new element: guidance. Now, the soldier did not just have to aim and fire. He could guide the projectile to its target with incredible accuracy, even against moving vehicles at much greater ranges. Yet, even in these sophisticated and expensive systems, the spirit of the original bazooka lives on. They are all, at their core, an answer to the same fundamental question that Edward Uhl and his team sought to solve: how to give the individual infantryman a credible defense against armor. The bazooka's legacy is also a humanistic one. It represented a democratization of power on the battlefield. Before its invention, anti-tank defense was the exclusive domain of specialized, heavy, and expensive equipment. The bazooka took that power and distributed it to the lowest tactical level. It was a weapon that championed the ingenuity and courage of the individual over the brute force of the machine. It embodied the idea that a small, well-trained team, armed with the right tool and a clever plan, could overcome a much larger and more powerful adversary. This narrative of David and Goliath, which played out in reality in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, continues to resonate. Today, the modern battlefield is more complex than ever, with threats from drones, precision artillery, and advanced armored vehicles. But the need for a potent, man-portable infantry weapon that can challenge these threats remains. The descendants of the bazooka, the guided missiles and smart rockets, are more important than ever. They continue to ensure that the soldier on the ground is not left helpless in the face of technological superiority. The echo of that first rocket, fired from a simple tube in 1942, can still be heard in the design and doctrine of modern armies. The bazooka was more than just a successful weapon. It was a paradigm shift. It was a declaration that the age of the tank's absolute dominion over the infantrymen was over. It created a new and lasting equilibrium, a balance of fear and respect that continues to define the relationship between armor and infantry to this day. It was a testament to the power of a simple, brilliant idea to change the world.